Okay, so let's talk about bias now. So remember, when we talk about bias here, we're not talking about like a predisposition for something the way we normally think about bias. Bias means a misrepresentation of what we're saying about a general population because our sample population wasn't representative of the population as a whole. So we're going to look at each of these situations and see if there's any bias and then talk about what the bias is. So the first situation, Jamar's trying to find out about how much of his school likes video games. So he surveys like the members of the chess club. Now, if he were trying to get a random sample, he would survey just random students, right? Not a particular group of students. Because he's interviewing just members of the chess club, that's going to present a bias. It's going to be a misrepresentation of the general population because it's not a random sample. So the bias is that the sample isn't random because everyone's in the chess club. Everyone in the sample is in the chess club, and not everyone in the entire school is in the chess club. So there's a bias. Now, on the second one, Sinitra wants to know what percentage of cars in the parking lot have bumper stickers, and she chooses a random samples of cars in the lot. So she's basically done a random sample, and they're just the cars in the lot, and that's what she's trying to make an inference about, are what the cars in the lot have. So this has no bias. By the way, if you hear noise in the background, my power just shut off and shut back on, so I have like things whirring in the background. Um, Gabrielle owns a cafe. One weekend, she hands out a survey, anonymous survey, that's good, at random to her customers, that's good. And she wants to know, she basically is inferring that the same percentage of her weekend crowd were extremely satisfied. And she surveyed her weekend crowd. Now, if she had done this survey on the weekend and had wanted to know about the general satisfaction of her entire like customer base, it would have a bias. But in this case, because the sample reflects the same traits as the population she's trying to infer about, there's no bias. Now, on the last one, and this is something you see all the time, we have a left-leaning website, could be a right-leaning website, I don't really care. It presents a poll on its site asking which presidential candidate its respondent supports. Of the 319 respondents, it finds that 239 support the Democratic nominee, and they're going to make an inference that that percentage of the entire American population supports the Democratic nominee. Now, if they were trying to infer what percentage of their actual readers supported the Democratic nominee, then that would be no bias. But because they're making an inference about the general population, and they only survey people who came to their website, there's a bias. And the bias is the survey takers are visitors to the website. By the way, there is one really cool example of bias that came up, and you may have heard of this, and I want to share it with you really quickly. So this is one of the most famous political photos of all time from the 1948 election. The Chicago Daily Tribune ran a headline that said that Thomas Dewey defeated Harry Truman in that election, and it turns out that that was not true. And it's an interesting story about why this headline happened. When the Chicago Daily Tribune was running their poll to see who was ahead, they actually conducted the entire poll via telephone. Now, in 1948, the telephones weren't as ubiquitous as they are now. Only richer people had them. And so they were sampling people who tended to be richer, who tended to vote more Republican. So their poll got messed up by an unintentional bias because their sample size didn't match the population at whole.